Today is September 27th. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki, Nagana go, Meko J Stukom Aki. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. Native Calgarian is being recorded on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south in the imposed US-Canadian border are the Blackfeet. North of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Bugani of the Confederacy. These lands are at Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaw nations of the Stoney Nation, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit status, and non across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. I honor the Blackfoot as the elders and members have been very kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot Mokinstis, as Michelle Elliott, an English name which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. My father is so Canadian. I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution, while having an Indian Act imposed status card. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Hare people, or like the bunnies, the rabbits, also called the Great Bear Lake people in Treaty 11. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene nation is a visitor to this area of Clincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning Many Horse Town, named after the Calgary Stampede. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as the guest and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner. My humblest apologies to the Blackfoot elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. Any mistakes or misinterpretations will be on me. I encourage questions so that misunderstandings can be cleared up as soon as possible. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous. I just share what I know as I walk down the red road. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to the previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or your questions. Also, giving a review helps, whichever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe, and you can go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. So a lot's happened since the last time I had a podcast, which was a week ago. A week ago was the day of the federal election, and we were all on pins and needles waiting, or maybe some of us were a little more than others. And for those who may not know, and to give context, I'm an open liberal. I've been with the Liberal Party of Canada since 2011. We had to do the whole rebuilding thing and rebranding thing, and we've been part of Team Trudeau since he started his leadership bid. And when we moved forward with new constitutions and kind of rebranded the Liberals after Justin Trudeau. So anyway, I really feel very passionate as a person who's put forward policy, voted on policy, guided the party the best I could, with a very small, limited voice in the bigger picture of a rich a rich party that has so many political connections. And I spoke to them beforehand about talking about Indigenous-led climate change and what we've been doing for the calls to justice. And I seen that in their messaging. So I was actually quite proud of the Liberals. And I know that was probably the opposite of what you've seen on social media with other Indigenous content creators. But, I'm a big believer that it's easy to, first of all, I'm a big believer that all activism matters. So I think it's important, the amount of people that are putting out incredibly great opinions. The one I value in the highest regard would be from the Yellowhead Institute, as well as Cindy Blackstock and Pam Palmater, on the things that should be done or things that are happening that are wrong. Those are things that I listen to intently and try to reflect back in the party. Some things I have no control over, I have no voice on. And, I can honestly say I have no relationship with some of the really prominent MPs. And that's a case of, I don't come from upper class. I don't have the connections that other people do. But, when we talk about policy, I have a small voice at the table, and that's what I try to do. So as an Indigenous Liberal, we have the Indigenous Peoples Commission, and that guides a lot of our Liberal policy. And unfortunately, we can't get in everything we wish we could, um, because even though uh, the relationship between Indigenous and Canadians is the number one priority of this government, that that it's not undoing 400 years of colonialism, anti-Indigenous sentiment, anti-Indigenous bias, point blank racist, white supremacist education system, and it's going to take time. So I know it's not perfect, but they know they're not perfect, and they're working really hard on it. And if they weren't, I wouldn't be at the table, point blank. So we did get a minority government. Again, not much had changed according to some, and according to others, it was a waste of time. A lot of people are talking about the waste of money. Um, folks, I'm going to push back on that, and I'm going to tell you, a lot of people have have spoke a lot of smack about the Trudeau government response to um, COVID, and the election was really the opportunity for people to say, no, we don't agree with what you did. And obviously not much changed. So I don't think actually people did disagree with how Justin Trudeau handled the COVID-19 pandemic response. And do I wish he'd do more? Yes. Do I think he did an awful job? Not at all. I'm disappointed actually with the other party's lack of, meaningful dialogue, meaningful solutions, costed criticism. So, for example, I kept hearing the drinking water issue. And the drinking water issue does matter because at the time that we made those promises, there were less boil water advisories and advisories in general. And they've not only gotten more since they were in charge, but they were able to address them. They were the first ones to develop a plan. Well, first of all, they were the first ones to develop or to talk about it as an issue, because the other parties were not talking about it as an issue. They were not given any information that of meaningful change. Now, I would argue Dr. Pam Palmater actually spoke about the amount of money that needed to be invested in 2015. Like even me as a liberal, I can critique my own government, but I generally don't, because I don't see meaningful criticism. If I did, I would welcome it. I think that we would incorporate it and we would move forward. But every election, you see the Conservatives, they actually don't care about clean drinking water. They don't care about reconciliation. Had they been in charge during the pandemic, I think as a country would be in a far worse condition. And then the NDP, again, no costed plan, no like real meaningful solutions on some of these issues that we're referring to. And then and honestly, for the hard time that people give the Liberal Party for how Jody Wilson Rainbow was, I would say maliciously attacked by our own party and the supporters. And to this day, I block Liberal Party MPs, Liberal supporters that don't recognize their anti-Indigenous bias when talking about her. I block them, but we were also exposed to the racism in the NDP. I think if you really understand anti-racism training, that you've seen the racist remarks against Jagmeet Singh. I think that if you really have anti-racism training, you've seen the anti-Black misogyny that was directed at the party leader of the Green Party. So, for progressives to talk about this is, it needs to be done as a country, and it's in all parties. Like the Conservatives are far, far, far worse. So, it's almost impossible to even address it in their party and at their level, because I just don't know if they have the comprehension skills on this issue at all. They're so embedded in white supremacy. So, a lot of people obviously have done lots of different critiques of the election, and that was some things that I wanted to focus on as a person who is a staunch Liberal supporter. and has worked really hard at trying to bring issues to the table. I was there when the former women's rep put forward the initial inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. We were the only party that cared about that issue, and I was at the floor in Montreal when it was unanimously voted upon. I took video of it. Ralph Goodale was the chair, and he said, "This is unanimous." Um, we've come a long way from there, but unfortunately, that day that happened was when Loretta Saunders was missing, and they were just recovering her body. And unfortunately, this week we have lost Loretta's sibling, who I didn't know had gone with a non-binary name, and yeah, and now a child is without both their mother and their auntie. So I I don't think Canadians understand the gravity of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, non-binary, trans, and our people are still dying as a result of it. There's not enough cultural supports for Indigenous people to deal with the intergenerational trauma, and we're still there. And now we've lost a wonderful activist, human being, and that's where we're at. So to me, this is very personal. It gets very much wrapped up in these elections, and I think sometimes people don't understand because they're not part of the colonial system that how hard these systems are to be in. And so I applaud the leader of the Green Party that just stepped down today, Anna May, I believe is her name, um, and her last name Paul, I think. Very, you know, person who probably put up with a lot of racism for this election and now has to step down. And I know Jagmeet Singh has dealt with a lot of it. I really have a hard time with people's criticism of him being on TikTok. One of the candidates that unfortunately didn't win, she was running against an incumbent, uh, Nikki Ashton. She had a friend of hers, a nephew that was a rapper and was putting out some really fun TikToks. And I thought it was a wonderful way to engage with youth and with Indigenous peoples in general. And he received criticism. I was looking in his comments. He received criticism for, aiding a liberal, but it was his auntie or a respected woman in his community that he called auntie. And for that, I'm so grateful for that. And I'm grateful. I wish that non-Indigenous understood the lateral violence that we endure for trying to create positive structural change in the best way we can within a colonial construct that doesn't really want us at the table. And, some folks are really, really excited for us to be there and some are not. And I was really proud of the way a lot of us had to carry ourselves. This was our first election that we didn't use the positive politics hashtag, and we went out on full attack. And I think we had to for survival. Um, we don't actually brag that much, and I've always thought for legalizing weed, well, I'll probably be a party loyalist, let alone, the incredible changes that we've seen to have the prime minister putting that the most important relationship is the ones with Indigenous peoples and reconciliation into their mandate minister letters that go out. And I'm going to be looking for that in the next round when any appointments happen in the cabinet. So I'm quite happy. I think Jagmeet Singh did a great service to us as a country by being at the table in a minority government. I think people really underestimate how much power minority governments can have. And I thought he did really great in the pandemic working with Justin. I wasn't as happy about a lot of the talking points I've seen out of their camp, but to be fair, during an election, it kind of becomes the bare knuckle round. And it's hard because even folks that I consider friends and allies, I see saying negative things about all sorts of things that I think are ridiculous. And I would never condemn Jagmeet Singh for his TikTok skills. I think that they're really important, and I think that they bring a demographic of youth to the table that wouldn't normally be there. I think that every party has a lot to learn about how to utilize that as a campaign tactic. So I hope that the parties all adapt and start including TikTok into their marketing strategies, and especially during a pandemic. So when we recorded last week, we knew that the numbers were going to be coming up of Alberta, and they were going to be bad. And they are. Hundreds every day. And we lost one of our elders at Awutan Healing Lodge, and we have the Sisters in Spirit mid-vigil coming up right away. She was a residential school survivor. And a matriarch to Treaty 7. So when folks say that COVID-19 is not real, they obviously haven't had any loss. I don't know people in the Indigenous community that don't know somebody that they've lost to COVID-19. One of the most hurtful things I've seen was a single mom out of Edmonton who she was a hairdresser trying hard to make ends meet, did not have the time to go and get vaccines. I never would blame her for that. It's hard enough existing as an Indigenous person, let alone as a mother, let alone as a single mother, let alone as a hairdresser in a pandemic. And she contracted it and died. And one of our top medical doctors, who's been a critic of the Kenny government's response to COVID-19, really humanized her in a good way. And unfortunately gave some details about how the kids watched their mother die and were trying to give her water before she had died. And folks don't understand how this pandemic is grossly affecting people of color, Indigenous people, because we're the ones who still have to work, because we're at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And because that oppression dynamic is still not understood, people are still asking for my free labor and asking free labor of many of Indigenous people. And unfortunately, a lot of us give it because, I got an email from one of the folks that I had spoken to at a panel discussion years ago on domestic violence, and I was the Indigenous rep. I was the person who, was trying to tell the Muslim community about the Indigenous plight. So I was invited to speak, and it was a Muslim organization, ICNA, and one of the Muslim sisters, wrote to me and asked me about September 30th, and I just wanted to talk about that because I do give out a lot of free resources, and just maybe if you're new or don't really understand how this is all interconnected, I'll just read to you that if you are a person that still doesn't know about September 30th, I think there's some really important resources for you to know. I highly recommend the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports, calls to action. There's 94 of them, and they're fundamentally important because Orange Shirt Day is to represent the survivors and those that didn't come home from Indian residential schools. All of this came out of the TRC report. Call to Action 80 is, demanding the government recognize this Memorial Day, and they did. And I'm very proud of that as an Indigenous liberal working with a prime minister that understands reconciliation. I thought this was really important. Now, I understand the criticisms from folks who are saying that it should have been mandated and it should be national and provinces shouldn't have a choice. And I couldn't agree more, but I'm going to use this moment to point out, if you really look, that's mainly conservative governments that are still refusing to pay attention to this issue, in denial. of the gravity of what Indian residential schools are. And I'm very sad that people still vote conservative, knowing they don't have any plan for the missing and murdered Indigenous women, 231 calls to justice. They have no plan for the 94 calls to action, and they have no costed plan for clean drinking water. They legitimately don't want Indigenous people to live. And their policies, especially here in Alberta, we have the Kenny government uh, refuses to acknowledge these issues. This is where we're at as a society. So, of course, it's over. Um, it's over representation of deaths with people of color, with Indigenous people, despite the wonderful work of our Indigenous doctors like Dr. James Makokis and Dr. Esther Tailfeathers advocating for Indigenous people to get the vaccine first, so that we had a better opportunity to fight this pandemic. We still are grossly overrepresented as folks dying in this pandemic, and we aren't even talking about the long-term health impacts that contracting COVID-19 and then surviving it is going to have on our population. So I really implore people to understand what September 30th is about. Calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report are free. The United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, that is the foundation to Truth and Reconciliation. That is also free and available in many different languages. Um, Also, the orangeshirtday.org actually talks about the history of Phyllis, who wore an orange shirt to Indian residential school, and it was taken away. And I highly recommend, there's nothing else you get from this. You just go on her website and play her videos and educate other people and talk about that. Um, the government actually has a whole teaching about why they did this holiday. Um, there's a few different links that they have as well. And, after September 30th, I highly recommend the October 4th vigils that happen nationally. So you can go to your local friendship center or Indigenous group, and also go to the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls and Two-Spirit, and have a look at their report and the 231 calls to justice. Here in Calgary, the English family is going to be walking from the Bunny up to Calgary starting October 2nd. There's a group from Edmonton that or from Red Deer that are coming south. And October 4th is our Sisters in Spirit Vigil in downtown Calgary. And we'll be marching from where those metal trees are on Stephen Avenue to City Hall and I guess Olympic Plaza. We have the permits, we are booked for that. We strongly recommend COVID protocols. So, wear your mask, sanitize your hands, wash your hands, social distance as we march together and mourn our missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and of course the missing children that have been highlighted in the media over the last year. A lot of folks are Indian residential school survivors. Please remember that the last one closed in 1997. And I graduated high school in 1994 in a non-Indigenous school. So to give context to how many survivors there still are out there, let alone the older ones that are still dealing with those horrors and traumas. So I've talked a bit about the federal election, talked a bit about Orange Shirt Day, talked a little bit about October 4th. But I definitely want to acknowledge the amount, the hell that we are in Alberta right now. All of our, I hate Kenny so much. And I don't like saying that of our premier. I think he should always be showing respect to elected officials, but I have zero respect for this man. The opposite. I have nothing but contempt for his handling of this pandemic. And it was a really awful, shitty move on his part to wait until after the federal election to ask for federal help and intervention. So the military is now coming to Alberta with doctors and nurses because our ICUs are over capacity right now. And they're in a triage system, which means that they just get to determine who dies and who doesn't on the spot. that's where we're at as a community. And we had some of our doctors say the only reason why we haven't had more numbers is because the people who were unvaccinated who had COVID-19 are dying in the ICU. And as soon as they die, they get to clean up the machine in the bed and put someone new there. And so we are going through absolute hell. It's unprecedented the amount of people we have in our ICUs, and every like surgery has been canceled. If you have, if you're on, if you are dying, you're gonna die in Alberta, thanks to the leadership and decision making of former federal conservative Jason Kenney, who is now our premier under the United Conservative Party. Uh, Apparently, there's grumblings that they want a leadership review in the spring, but I don't care. All of them are complicit. All of the voters for conservatives are complicit. And then we just had a federal election to also talk about, to prove um, so many things. I'm actually angry and frustrated in Alberta in so many ways because Alberta has taken so many benefits from the COVID-19 response, and yet didn't bother electing a liberal. And that really pisses me off. My own family was one that actually benefited from the liberal and Jagmeet Singh's, additions to the COVID-19 response. If it wasn't for them, I don't know if I would even be able to talk to you and tell you about this right now, because we are not in a financial good shape at all. And but it would be worsened if it wasn't for the COVID-19 relief programs that were available for our family. Let me remind you, oil and gas does not love you back. My husband was one of the first people laid off, which was ironic because supply chain and procurement designations that he has is what brought us to the company that laid him off. They had hunted him because his type of position helps give transparency for the stock market. And so we thought his role out of all people would be safe, but we were mistaken. And we've had a tough 18 months. But as you know, the podcast has continued. And now I'm a homeschool mom. So I took my daughter to Scrutineer with me. That was the request that we were given from the party. We were actually told not to door knock because of the ridiculous issues that we're facing here in Alberta with COVID-19. So even though I'm double vaxxed, it's just not worth having events, being out there and doing these things that could possibly bring more harm. So we were scrutineers, and Elections Canada they were set up really well to have social distancing for all people. So we weren't in a lot of contact. We were in a big gym, and my daughter, who's 14, came to sit with me, and we went over a lot of the behind the scenes things that happen during an election, and really got to educate her about our colonial democracy. I say that because the majority of people still don't vote, which is disappointing. But that said, there were barriers for First Nations to be able to vote because of the COVID-19 restrictions and polling stations being in places that couldn't accommodate the COVID-19 restrictions. So therefore there was no poll stations, and they didn't contact the First Nations in time. And during the global pandemic, there wasn't always the resources available. And that said, the Mohawk, I love how strong they are. They were like, we don't want your colonial polls on our land anyway. And they just kicked Elections Canada right out. So, Mohawks, they're tough, man. And I thank them because they also inspire other nations and the youth. And I am honored to hear them speak that way. Of course, I want to see Indigenous representation in our political system, but not at the expense of treaties that they've already broken. And I have deepest respect for the Mohawk Nation deciding that Elections Canada can't even be in their nation's boundaries because, I mean, all of Canada is on Indigenous stolen land. So, speaking of which, I want to address land back. Um, had a conversation with a fellow that didn't understand the issue of land back, and which says to me they doesn't understand the concept of broken treaties and what the treaties are. So it's really important that if you have questions about land back, that you research it, that you learn about it, rather than giving ignorant opinions about it. And the bottom line is that I think it's 80% of Canada is considered crown land, and it's not held like even for private buying. It's really held for corporations to exploit the resources as long as they get the right permit requests through the provincial or territorial means. And I think folks don't understand like that is literally stolen land. So Cree, Dene, Métis who have trap lines, like that's just stolen land, and there is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be given at minimum 50% of our land back, let alone just sharing it. And again, you don't understand treaties. The Blackfoot and Cree used to have yearly and an anniversary of getting together yearly and talking about disputes that happened over the course of the year. And they would meet in Wetaskiwin, a place where peace, the hills where peace is made. That's literally the translation of Wetaskiwin. And again, I have a land acknowledgement teaching. If you're in Alberta, this is really critical knowledge that you understand the importance of land acknowledgements, the theft of the land, who owns the land, who should own the land. These are really important conversations for us to be having. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the vaccine passports and some of the other issues happening here in Alberta. So anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers are protesting for so-called freedoms, but of course they've never been there for any other health freedoms. I remember way back in 2010 when the original C-36 came out on the so-called, Safe Communities Act. And it really did outlaw a lot of the natural health products that were available. A lot of my liberal friends would disagree with me, but unregulated natural health products were helpful to me as a mother when I was having my baby. And what that bill did was, demand that it have certain regulations, certain bar numbers and shit on it. And to me at that time, it was an infringement on my health freedoms. And at that time, it was Sean Buckley that was really leading that. He has a nonprofit organization, and I fell out of touch with them and their fight because obviously I had experienced racism giving birth to my daughter, and that a lot of these white nonprofits will never acknowledge the racism, and so I can't really align myself with a lot of values of these white nonprofits anymore. Not disagreeing with Sean Buckley in any capacity. I just haven't been able to really pay attention for 10 years now of things going on. But I guess back to health freedoms, like again, the cannabis community was fighting for health freedoms, and all of these yahoos weren't fighting for that ban. They also weren't fighting for midwifery, which I did. They weren't fighting for abortion rights. These are real health freedoms. Being asked to wear a mask or get a vaccine during a pandemic, a global pandemic that has millions of people dead. It's so selfish. I mean, even then, when I was in that world, I understood personal responsibilities. I'll give an example. My daughter had chickenpox, and we purposely exposed her, so it would be called a so-called chickenpox party. But we had oodles of data on how to combat chickenpox if contracted, and it wasn't deadly. So these were things that all of the mothers, all the parents that were at this party knew, how to address this. And we also knew the incubation time, from the time of the party to the time of incubation. And I kept my daughter home, even much to the chagrin of at the time the school was saying, well, it's day 12. She hasn't shown any symptoms. And I said, no, it's this amount of time before she shows the symptoms. sure enough, on the last day is when she ended up getting the pox. And I was really proud that we were responsible enough to keep her home and not expose her. And yet these yahoos don't understand that. Like, you don't want to get vaccinated. There's a responsibility with that, a responsibility to not go to restaurants and NHL games and all sorts of things that people have determined is okay for you to go to, Stampede, but people are anyway. And, I'm fully vaccinated. I have my 2 shots. I still wear a mask everywhere I go because I know the way we transmit it is through droplets. And even if I'm asymptomatic, I can still be a carrier. So I wear a mask. And this isn't something that's going to be forever like the conspiracies tell you. This is something that's just going to happen for this pandemic. Once we have things under control, of course we can take off our masks, but we are the opposite there. Um, for those who may not know, Alberta decided to just stop contact tracing July 1st. And of course, we are in the worst part of this pandemic that we've experienced ever. As a result, we've opened up the schools and decided that the privacy of the students matter more than contact tracing. So now we have a whole demographic that can be asymptomatic carriers, or symptomatic carriers. Lots of people send their kids to school with a snotty nose, always have and always will. And that's what's happening in Alberta. Worse, a group out in Edson decided to have a COVID party. And we found out because they were in the Edmonton ICU beds. They were all at this COVID-19 party. And so Albertans have the idea that we can reach natural herd immunity thanks to the Premier's leadership. And as a result, we are dying. And we are dying incredibly. And I'm so angry, disappointed. I have nothing but contempt for the Premier. And I can't believe how people who think they know about freedoms don't. They not only don't know, but they are misusing their, freedom to kill others at this point. And honestly, it's a really important lesson for those who deny Indigenous people, our truth about how smallpox was spread on purpose. This is the equivalent. I'm sure at that time you had yahoos who thought they were just given herd immunity, knowing damn well it was disproportionately killing Indigenous people. So, never downplay how a pandemic affects Indigenous communities and the barriers that we have. We don't even have clean drinking water. How can we wash our hands and, take care of ourselves? It's the most ridiculous thing. I think Canadians are under such a false illusion of, equality and oppression in this in this construct. So anyway, I wanted to address those things, encourage folks to come out to the September 30th events that will be happening, or at least when I say that, because we are in the middle of a pandemic, there are so many Zooms that are available nationally, let alone locally, wherever you're listening from. So I strongly encourage you to be a part of those discussions and those conversations, and help be a part of the solution. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that means you still haven't read the 94 calls to actions, still don't know about Phyllis's story about the orange shirt. It's critical that you do these things and that you don't expect Indigenous people to do your work for you. Moving forward, the municipal election is now next on my radar. So the Reconciliation Action Group that we founded from the renaming Langevin School, we put together a bunch of questions for the school trustees as well as the municipal candidates in Calgary. And we're just collecting that information, and we'll put it out there publicly. And as a homeschool mom, we're going to do the same thing for all the Lethbridge school trustee and city councillor candidates, and see what their responses are. Unfortunately, the time is coming up so quick before the advance vote, and I feel a little woefully underprepared because as soon as I'm done this, I have to go to bed and run tomorrow for an early morning meeting at 10 with some federal group, and then meet with my floors and such. And yeah, it's just go, go, go. And yeah, that's what's been going on in my world. And I hope you really question your municipal candidates, your school trustee candidates, on whether or not they even agree Indigenous genocide happened in Canada, because that has become the number one issue, I think, for us to have meaningful reconciliation. Because if you have folks who can't admit the truth, then you sure as hell can't have reconciliation. So please learn about land back. Please learn about, you know, Indigenous genocide in general, the pandemic response. This was another fun thing that happened in Alberta. So Jason Kenney hates liberals, and he hates them so much he can't even call, a record of your vaccines a vaccine passport like the rest of the country is, because he hates Trudeau so much he can't even govern. So he put out some ridiculous name for a vaccine passport that I won't even repeat. I won't bother remembering because it's stupid and ridiculous. Um, AHS is our Alberta Health Services. They put out this website that you can fill out your vaccine information, and it was so basic. It was like, you put in your healthcare number, your name, and when you got your vaccine month. So I did, got my daughter's, my husband's, and mine all sorted out, and then printed them off on my black and white printer that doesn't even have like that fine printing on it, and then used packing tape to kind of laminate it. And it looked like some stupid kindergarten, craft that we did. But I'm really glad we did it, because then on Saturday when we were in Calgary cleaning the house and that, we found, we went to certain establishments and they didn't give a flying fuck whether or not you had your vaccine shots, and they certainly didn't demand a passport. But then when we went to Denny's, they not only wanted our vaccine passport, but they also wanted our ID. So, and they were really serious about it. And of course, we were accommodating, because I think that if you're not from an Alberta, you don't know, but Albertans who think they're freedom fighters are literally attacking these establishments and attacking the waiters, waitresses, and such, and saying that they have the right to come into people's private businesses and do whatever the hell they want and spread COVID. And when they actually get a no, they don't even know what to do with themselves. So, unfortunately, they've been getting this. So I was quick to thank the Denny staff for being so diligent on that issue. And I encourage other companies to be diligent on this. And yeah, I don't know what next week is going to look like with the rise in numbers, but I can tell you, I seen march, 1,000 people march, of people without masks on. It like legitimately as a COVID party every time that they have these stupid rallies. And our numbers are just going to go up and up, because our premier refuses to show any leadership. He's accommodating anti-vaxxers. There's no nice way to say it. And him and his caucus are listening to these, I don't know, Russian conspiracy theorists that believe that they're somehow losing their freedoms. And the irony is they'd be the first ones against communism, and yet they promote fascism in their own ways. And who suffers? The most marginalized. So that's how come I know the conservatives only care about killing Indigenous people, because that's what they do. That's what they've done best, and that's what they'll continue to do. Other thing that came up this week was the bishops, Catholic bishops, came out and put out an apology. And I'm just going to encourage non-Indigenous to sit down and shut up about it. You have no right to give in your stupid fucking hot takes on things. Even I, as someone who didn't attend Indian residential school, I just amplify the voices of survivors. I don't give my hot take, because it's not mine to give, because I didn't have to go through it. Same thing with clean drinking water, all these things I've seen through the federal election. Honestly, I can't stand half of the folks that think that they're so-called progressive, because they think they have the right to talk about these issues instead of amplifying Indigenous voices on it. And it doesn't have to be mine, it can be anybody's, but I'll never forget nor forgive one of the Ward 9 staffers who put out a shitty tweet that said on Canada Day, well, if you can't enjoy Canada Day, I don't know what's wrong with you. Totally belittling the issue of missing children and unmarked graves. And it is what it is. These are people who think they're progressive, and you know, challenge your candidates, your school trustee candidates, your municipal candidates, your mayoral candidates on where they fit on their so-called understanding of Indigenous issues, and vote accordingly. Because if you vote for conservatives, if you vote for or for Indigenous deniers, you're voting for this world to be unsafe for me and my daughter. And I can't make it clearer than that. So that was something really interesting that came up. Anyway, back to the vaccine passport in Alberta. It turned out this PDF was you could edit it. And so like simple software solutions were being tweeted out to the Alberta government to fix it. And the Alberta government was like, oh, I think it was AHS that put out a tweet that said, oh, well, we can't fraudulently put out these things. And I'm like, my God. And then worst of all, yesterday, there was this young software fellow who realized that the app that was being promoted for the NHL games, because in Alberta, we gave that the green light despite our ICU beds being in the state they're in. They gave the green light, and the passport app that they were encouraging folks to use, it wasn't anything that it claimed to be. It wasn't safe. It was ridiculous. And anyway, this young software engineer exposed it, and the Sun and the Herald wrote a column, and this young guy actually called them out and said that was really one-sided. They didn't ask him for his opinion, but they were willing to print about it. So there's absolutely nothing going on in Alberta in regards to COVID-19 that's positive or in the right direction at all. Our premier's playing petty politics with the lives of Albertans, and you know what? As awful as that is, it doesn't matter because the average Albertan will still vote blue, and it sucks. It sucks federally and provincially because you can try as hard as you can to engage with regular people, but they are so committed to conservatism that they're willing to let people die. And so I hope it's a learning lesson for all of us of why it is, Indian residential schools happened, the Holocaust happened, this pandemic response, the opioid crisis that we're facing that's still not being properly addressed. But you'll see that in Alberta here, both the AHS and the Conservative will talk about, children's mental health, but they've never cared about it before, and they've certainly cut all funding towards anything that has helped children's mental health, whether they were in the school system beforehand or after. There's just not support systems for learning in the school systems. There's not support systems for mental health for children, and certainly not for their parents that are struggling and dealing with addiction issues, and definitely not culturally appropriate addiction services for Indigenous peoples. So if you get a chance, I strongly encourage Googling the White Bison Society. Heather Morageau, I know, is running a program for Wellbriety, and that's at least somewhat culturally appropriate. But my God, until AHS understands the gravity, the need for this, and there's government that funds it properly and voting base that understands the gravity of this issue, there's not going to be any change. So anyway, I'm going to close out because I could go on, and I think I have, and I will give the same solutions I do in every podcast. I'm proud that this podcast has given solutions and included cultural training, cultural first aid in almost all of them to create a safer space for Indigenous people of color, those with disabilities, and LGBTQ2+ to speak. So Google cultural safety training, Google cultural first aid. And I want to say thank you to Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fridkin of hereToHelp.bc.ca for putting out what is Indigenous cultural safety and why it matters as a piece to talk about these things. Their work and those cultural action tools I've said over 100 times in my podcast. So please support Indigenous work like that as part of your reconciliation work and understandings as a settler. I'm just lucky enough to repeat them and highlight them here. Internalized racism or lateral violence is another form of violence that Indigenous people face. And you've seen that all during the federal election on Twitter. What is Internalized Racism by Donna Bevans is a PDF that's available. Again, highly recommend just Googling lateral violence or internalized racism to understand this issue more if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you're an Indigenous person. Do's and don'ts for bystander intervention by American Friends Service Committee. So if you've seen a Muslim getting harassed on the sea train, this is the type of thing that you would look for. Again, Google cultural safety training. You'll find these resources. If you see or experience racism, you can also report it at acttoendracism.ca or text at 587-507-3838. That was a coalition of an Asian community-based program. So really happy that they did that work. Indigenous have been talking about our issues, sharing our traumas in reports, commissions, and public hearings so it can be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words. Honor the treaties. Listen to politicians and their policies and platforms. They don't recognize the marginalized with their budget with Gender Equity Plus. If they're cutting violence prevention programs and services, Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gay straight alliances, lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities, know that your vote to that party or person directly negatively impacts marginalized people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the multiple reports about child welfare reform, violence prevention programs, and now 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. Denying those reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in the educational and health institutions with multiple reports that say the same things. Demand change from election platforms and politicians. They don't understand colonialism, racism, privilege, sexism. They have zero business running. Should be understood by all local politicians, community organizations, parties, sports clubs, community associations, and more. Really great article I said out loud was Truth Before Truth, How Non-Indigenous Canadians Become Allies. I can't emphasize enough that just Googling how to be an ally to Indigenous people warrants many different articles that come up. There really is no excuse anymore. But for Indigenous people, if you are experiencing emotional distress after anything I said and you need to talk, the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline is at 1-855-242-3310. It's toll free 24 hours a day. If you go onto their website, they actually have a text option if you would prefer that. If more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, you can call 844-413-6649. If you're non-Indigenous, you usually have a functioning 211 in your area, or you can also call in Canada 833-456-4560 skip 4566. There's also a 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Alberta at ssisa.ca. You can look under the hashtag Survivor Driven. I also want to give a shout out to the Trevor Project. They have lots of resources for LGBTQ2+ youth. They have a peer support line, they have a trans lifeline. So I highly recommend lifevoice.ca, crisis supports, LGBTQ crisis supports. I hope one day I can encourage that community, always include the two for reconciliation. But until then, I try to. But unfortunately, the website address does not for now. Anyway, you can also call the Kids Help phone at 1-800-668-6868 if you're a youth. I use that as a resource. I encourage you to as well. Violence is an everyday reality for Indigenous people. Every generation has faced it. That's why I started a podcast to speak freely without interruption, without tone police, without leadership shaming, without gaslighting questions, as many people don't want to hear Indigenous opinions, sure want to tell us theirs, even if they know nothing about colonialism, Indigenous peoples, our constant surveillance of our protests, our vigils, our rights, microaggressions, people dealing with internalized racism who become gatekeepers that survive off the status quo, or people who are just in their trauma and stop people from doing the work and deplete personal resources. Internal and external racism is an everyday reality for Indigenous people. But I do want to say thank you to my ancestors, my granny, my mom, what strength looks like through her example, my aunts, my uncles, my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, my stepmom for showing me what a strong culture is with her Austrian family and roots and teaching me to be a proud Calgarian. It is through her. I'm a second generation. That said, if you call yourself a native Calgarian, I'll laugh at you if you're non-Indigenous. I hope when I say that, you understand how racist it sounds. To identify as native when you are not native. I want to say thank you to my husband, Darcy, for producing and editing this show. On top of being my husband, my childhood friend, father of our child, he's been my support down my journey of the Red Road and has witnessed decades of racism and sexism. And to our child, we are blessed to learn from daily. I'm honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. I hope my daughter and my family will be proud in the future of us trying to discuss these present day issues in a way that they will understand down the road. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching, you can afford to give. Thank you. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or your questions. I also have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. And I want to end with side eye to those Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not tradish. And my beautiful cousin would respond, or you'd be in my dish. Hope you enjoyed listening. Also, big plug out to uh, the reservation dogs. Funny show, and I'm only into episode 4. So I hope you enjoyed my show. I hope you enjoyed that show, and congratulations to Pauline, Alexis, and the entire crew of Reservation Dogs for their great work and any nominations that they received. It was wonderful to see you on the red carpet and giving us this representation, and the memes have been absolutely wonderful. Hope you're all enjoying them if you see me on social media. Anyway, thanks again, everyone. Take care. Be safe. Right now in Alberta, if I got in a car accident, I don't know what would happen. And I hear helicopters even in Lethbridge, which I don't normally do. So be safe. Thank you for listening.